I certainly have seen, denials that a lot of the crazier accusations are true,
Right.
which I think is generally true, and I've certainly seen coordinated defenses from the Indian government and different people, Indian diaspora reporters, such that have tried to give a more realistic narrative. I think the problem, from my perspective anyway, is not so much that they have played defense wrong. It's that in the long run, your best defense is a good offense, and
Right.
that's what has been lacking in my view. It's one thing to, I can't remember. There was a webinar with some Islamist groups that were saying that recently. I'm trying to remember which one. I can't right off the top of my head, but they were saying something completely insane, like
Right.
50,000 people have been murdered in Kashmir over the past 6 months or something. I mean, just totally bonkers, crazy stuff that clearly hadn't happened. But as long as you're kind of saying, well, that's not true. Well, okay, maybe it's not, but there probably has been some innocent children caught in the crosshairs, and the Islamists make sure that is all across social media and everywhere.
Yeah.
There probably have been some individual soldiers that have done some bad things or made some questionable judgments, and so if you're only playing defense, it's only the misses, it's only the problems that are ever going to get a focus.
Yeah.
What there needs to be, in my view, is both on the part of the Indian government and Indian diaspora, and basically anybody that favors freedom, democracy, and opposes theocracy, is going back at their opponents and saying, "Hey, look, you're saying that it sucks that this child got caught in the crossfires and now had to have their leg amputated or something. That's horrible. Let's talk about what Hizbul Mujahideen has done. Well, let's talk about the kinds of things Jamaat-e-Islami has enabled. Let's talk about what Lashkar-e-Taiba really believes. Let's talk about what their enablers in the West really, believe." As pointed out, or Sam pointed out too, there's not a clear answer to what they actually want. They just don't want India. Okay, you want Pakistan? Let's talk about Pakistan and how things go there.
Yeah.
As a Heritage Foundation study pointed out recently, the Kashmiri Indian Muslims, under the harshest part of the lockdown after the abrogation of 370, have more civil rights and civil liberties than Pakistani Muslims do every day.
Yeah.
Make those kinds of points and make them a lot more loudly, and start asking these people, what do you actually favor? How do you favor civil rights? How do you favor freedom? What about the rights of women? What about the rights of religious minorities? Stick the fight back to them. That is something I have seen, at least from my perspective, only on a very limited basis.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to be much more extensive.
Yeah, it's also, again, it's obviously a situation where India can learn from Israel, because back in the 1980s, when the international campaign against Israel really took off, it was back then they started talking about the need to respond through PR, through various initiatives, and they didn't do it very seriously at first, and people warned them this is going to go badly for you, and it did go badly for them. The boycott movement was born. Governments around the world were once friendly to Israel started to turn against it, especially at international fora like the United Nations. But Israel did eventually wake up, and I think I'm not the expert in this, but there were two lessons that I'm somewhat aware they learned. Firstly, there's a very limited use to the language of good news. The temptation in the beginning was to publish lots of photos of Israelis and Palestinians getting along and playing in a school, cooking falafel together, that kind of thing. There's a limited value to that kind of stuff, even if it's true. Limited value. You still, but by not responding to the lies and the propaganda and the attacks directly, you're allowing those to flourish. While your good news looks like propaganda of its own. The Israel sort of started to really defend itself when it set up dedicated social media units within the army, within the government, when it went on the attack, when it published information about the terrorist groups in far greater detail than any other government around the world has done. India should do the same. How many people, take out a room of 100 Americans, how many have heard of Jaish-e-Mohammed? How many have heard of Lashkar-e-Taiba? I'm betting, unless there's an Indian in that room, I'm betting none of them have heard those names. And these should be almost, these names should be as well known as Hamas. Certainly these groups kill probably a lot more people than Hamas does in terms of sheer numbers. That's what the Indian government needs to do. Huge campaigns to educate the world on the evils that it's facing and why the defense of India is the defense of the West.
You know, one thing I'd like to point out that this is a little detail that I found interesting and kind of frustrating. There is a book written by a Pakistani named Arif Jamal called Shadow War. It's about Kashmir. And Arif Jamal is a straight up truth teller. He's not a Pakistani partisan, but he is ethnically Pakistani. You know, was born there, all that. And you know, he points out something in his book that that basically Jamaat-e-Islami, for all practical purposes, founded Hizbul Mujahideen, and he discusses how that was done. You point that out to your average Pakistani, or frankly, even your average Indian, Bangladeshi, or even American that discusses these issues, and well, no, that's different. Jamaat and Hizbul, they're totally different. Like, to what degree? To what really? I mean, it's like there may be some sort of small cleavage there.
Yeah.
But, they don't get talked about in the same way terrorist groups and their Islamist partners do in the Middle East. These connections and obvious connections, don't get pointed out. So
my suggestion, as I mentioned earlier, although I was talking about India, the States in this case, but in terms of the diaspora as well, don't over focus on good news. Don't show the lovely side of India, lovely though it may be. Don't obsess over that, because that allows the lies and the propaganda, the agitprop to flourish. Hindu groups, Sikh groups, all sorts of Indian community groups should be collaborate. Anyone with a shared interest in defending against the onslaught, the clear, powerful onslaught against India. Set up research groups, set up activism groups, hire law firms, hire PR firms, go on the offensive, go after these networks, go after these groups, go after them in court, go after them in the media, go after them in Congress and in the state legislatures, make sure they're not getting federal monies, make sure the media is investigating their extremist roots. Produce the research to make this possible for everyone else. And selfishly, work with us to do all this.
Right.
This does need to be done. It, as the Jewish community knows all too well, this is the only thing really you can do. This is an intelligence war, really. And as I mentioned before, the Jewish community was a little slow in realizing that, and they still are. The Hindu community can preempt a lot of trouble by preparing now and getting ready now. At the very least, understanding Pakistan's role in all of this here in the US, that would be pivotal. And certainly, I'm sure the Indian government would have an interest in supporting and collaborating with any effort here to do this kind of thing, to uncover the extent and the enormity of the threat. This is certainly part of our focus for the next few years. So the more allies we see in the Indian diaspora, the better.
And Cliff, on the governmental side, like what kind of a response have you seen from the Indian government in being able to tackle this lobby? And what would you say would be something that the government would need to do?
I'm not a diplomat.
Sure.
I don't know how to gauge all that, and all the things they have to balance. I have seen certainly some effort to push back, but.
Do you think? Okay, let me rephrase that. Maybe. Do you think that there's, in terms of the response that you may have seen diplomatically from like a country like Israel, is there lessons there for India to follow?
Yeah, I think Israel is far more aggressive at calling these people out as a government and saying sort of what's going on, and telling the story not of themselves, which is fine, as Sam put. It's fine to talk about how great Israeli falafel or Indian chicken vindaloo is. It's better to point out, hey, that guy that is attacking me is, a Hizbul Mujahideen sympathizer. These people represent Hamas. I don't think there has been sort of a concerted effort to do that. At the very least, it does not seem to me it has been a high enough priority, because in the long run, if they are the only ones telling if they're telling their story about you and you're not telling their story about them, then only one side ultimately gets heard. The fact that you say nice things about yourself doesn't matter much.
And the other thing, again, I'm imposing upon your stream here, upon your viewers, but grassroots, crowdsourcing this work, as Cliff said, just as an example, we came across a poster last week, a bunch of Texas activists, anti-Indian activists, and a couple of local state politicians doing a big webinar with someone we worked out was the sibling of a known terrorist in Kashmir. So this is basically Americans and Kashmiri activists collaborating with a terrorist family. Wow. We came across this by accident. Imagine how much we're missing. We're not seeing. And your viewers, your listeners, you can help with this. You know, I mean, hopefully the Hindu community will set up its own institutions to do this, but you can help this. You'll come across this on social media, in newsletters. Sign up to local anti-Indian groups, local Kashmiri groups, local Islamist groups. Find out what they're doing on Kashmir. And when you come across events, when you come across information, write about it yourself or send it to us. You know, this kind of stuff, we can only cover a minuscule part of it because we're limited by the number of people we employ to research this stuff.
Right.
Through crowdsourcing, through your help, we can do a huge amount. So yeah, send us information if you come across it.